It was 11 a.m. on Monday the 30th of March 1896 when bargeman Charles Humphreys and his bargemate reached the King's Meadow area of the River Thames in Reading. Having left the mouth of the River Kennet some distance behind, Caversham Weir with its wooden footbridge, which was known as Clapper's Bridge, now lay ahead. They were 7 feet from the shore when they noticed a small brown paper package in the water. Hooking it and then pulling it to shore, they began to unwrap the twine-tied paper followed by the layers of flannel sheets. The men reeled in horror as a tiny foot and part of a leg were exposed. Leaving the grim find on the Thames footpath, guarded by his bargemate, Humphreys went to the police station, returning 15 minutes later with a police officer named Barnett. Officer Barnett placed the package in a sack and took it to the mortuary where he unwrapped the parcel and revealed the body of a baby girl. Thought to be between 12 and 18 months old, she had white tape wrapped around her neck and there was a brick wrapped up beside her. On examination of the body, Coroner O.C. Maurice confirmed that the child, who was later identified as Helena Fry, had died from strangulation, but whoever had placed her in the river had taken no care in concealing evidence. At the Reading Borough Police Station, one Detective Constable James B.T. Anderson inspected the parcel and found a postal stamp dated the 24th of October 1895 from Bristol Temple Meads train station. On the wrapping paper itself, he was able to make out the name Mrs. Thomas and a Reading address, 26 Piggott's Road in Lower Caversham. An investigation into the origin of the paper used to wrap the child was undertaken, and at the mail office of Reading train station, one clerk recognised the address and confirmed that the parcel had passed through the office the previous October. Although the address written was Piggott's Road, the clerk knew that the recipient's current address was 45 Kensington Road, Caversham. When the home was investigated, neighbours informed officers that the occupant had left for London. The house was put on surveillance and on the 3rd of April, when Constable James Anderson and Sergeant Harry James knocked on the door of number 45 Kensington Road, they were met by one Amelia Elizabeth Dyer. Born in 1837, Amelia Elizabeth Hobley grew up in Bristol and was the daughter of Samuel and Sarah Hobley. She was the youngest of 5 children, although only herself and 2 brothers survived into adulthood. It's believed that she had a good upbringing and a relatively good education. However, from a young age, Amelia spent much of her time caring for her mother, who suffered from mental illness and the effects of the bacterial disease typhus. Following her mother's death in 1848 at the age of 45, 11-year-old Amelia lived with her aunt in Bristol, where she would later work as a dressmaker. When her father passed away in 1859, just one day before her 22nd birthday, Amelia became estranged from her 2 brothers when one of them inherited the family shoemaking business. In 1861, the now 24-year-old Amelia married 59-year-old George Thomas, moved to Trinity Street in Bristol, and trained as a nurse at the Bristol Royal Infirmary. It's reported that in 1864, Amelia had a child she named Ellen, but apparently there are no records to authenticate her birth, so it's unclear as to whether or not she was their natural child. In 1868, as a way of making extra money, she took on a boarder, a young woman named Ellen Dane. Now, Ellen Dane ran her own business from the house, taking in and caring for pregnant women. It was a time when pregnant women were not allowed to work, there was no state assistance, abortion was an illegal medical risk, many orphanages would not accept children unless the mother had died, and single motherhood was stigmatised. This led to a lot of infants being abandoned, often without the child's birth being registered. The introduction of the so-called New Poor Laws in 1834, which was an amendment of the old law, absolved fathers of any responsibility for children born out of wedlock. The intention of the law was to stop, or at least reduce, the amount of illegitimate children being born, but it had the opposite effect, as men were now able to avoid all responsibility. The number of unwanted children rose dramatically, and Ellen Dane would take in mothers-to-be when it was no longer possible for them to conceal their pregnancy. When a child was born, they would either pay a weekly fee for the infant to be raised as a nurse child, meaning they would be adopted in-house, or a one-off fee for the child to be fostered to another family. This was a common practice crudely known as baby farming. Amelia's husband George passed away in 1869, and in desperate need for a more considerable income, Amelia joined Ellen Dane in the baby farming business, even sending her own daughter to a foster home in the Stoke Bishop area of Bristol so that she could put all of her efforts into her new enterprise. But the financial reward for taking in young women and nursing them to term was minimal, and after a while Amelia worked exclusively as a fosterer. But she found the responsibility involved in caring for the children too great, and infants in her care began to die due to neglect. Because child mortality was common then, with 50% of children dying before the age of 5 in the most impoverished areas, coupled with the fact that baby farming was not yet properly regulated, these deaths rarely raised any suspicion. In 1869, Amelia began advertising her services in newspapers, portraying herself as a caring woman, offering a loving home to children whose parents were unable to care for them. She began to use aliases such as Harding, Smith, Weymouth and Stanfield, as she went from home to home collecting babies from across the country, going as far afield as Liverpool and Plymouth, charging anything from £10 to £100. Being an unscrupulous woman, Amelia took in more children than she could handle, and now with a house full of noisy, hungry children, she turned to a method often used by mothers at the time. Godfrey's cordial, also known as Mother's Friend or the Quietness, was a sweet, spiced medicine containing laudanum or liquid opium. This medicine, which was later defined as a Class A substance in the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, was often administered to children to suppress hunger, often leaving them in a docile state. Overuse of the drug was common, and many children died, either from overdose or starvation due to lack of appetite. For Amelia, these child deaths, rather than being rare and unfortunate events, soon became imperative if she was to maximise on the profits of her business. And so it was that Amelia went from irresponsible and dangerous carer to cold-blooded killer, but a new social awareness threatened her ill-gotten gains. By 1870, Parliament had become more concerned with the welfare of children following the crimes of Margaret Waters and her associate Sarah Ellis. Known as the Brixton Baby Farmers, they were arrested and tried in 1870 for similar crimes, and two of Amelia's aliases were mentioned in the letters found at Waters' home. Amelia now feared that her days were numbered. She gave up the business and went to work as an attendant in a mental asylum, a place that seldom opened to the public or the law, so a good place to lay low for a while. When Margaret Waters was hanged at Horsemonger Lane Gaol in October of 1870, Ellen, Amelia's business partner, fled to the US, because if Amelia was caught, she too would hang. Amelia eventually left the asylum and in 1872 married William Dyer. Over the next few years, the couple moved around Bristol, living in the Totterdown, Fishponds, Horfield and Eastville areas. As they did, they had two children of their own, Mary Ann, who was also known as Polly, and William Samuel. Throughout this time, Amelia continued to be immersed in baby farming, but suspicions were finally raised in 1879 when Dr. John Milne reported that he had certified the deaths of 4 children at Amelia's home in the space of 2 weeks. They were 8-month-old Evelyn Townsend, 6-week-old Elizabeth Thomas, a boy named Alfred Channing, and 9-week-old May Walters. During the inquest into their deaths, Amelia Dyer's eldest daughter Ellen, who had by now returned from her foster care, gave evidence to the jury. The now 16-year-old, who understandably had little loyalty towards her mother, told of at least 5 other children who had died in her mother's care. Despite the high infant mortality rate at the time, this was considered extreme. In a desperate attempt to evade the law, Amelia Dyer attempted suicide by taking a massive laudanum overdose. However, due to her long-term dependency and tolerance of the drug, she survived. When she eventually faced judgment, the coroner summed up by saying that Dyer had been overwhelmed by the responses of her advertised services and could not care for the children properly. It was decided that the infants had died from neglect, as opposed to cold-blooded murder or even manslaughter. Inconceivably, the jury returned a verdict of death by natural causes in all cases, meaning that Amelia Dyer could walk away a free woman. However, the execution of Margaret Walters in 1870 saw the introduction of the Infant Life Protection Act of 1872. This meant that any household taking in more than one adopted child under the age of 12 months needed to register them with the police. Amelia Dyer had breached that law, something that wasn't realised until a month later. In August of 1879, at the age of 46, she received the maximum penalty of 6 months' imprisonment with hard labour, to be served at Shepton Mallet in Somerset. On her release from Shepton Mallet in 1880, Dyer set up a laundry business, but when it failed, she reverted back to baby farming. Now realising the risks involved in doctors issuing death certificates, she began disposing of the bodies herself. To hasten death, she used a method of strangulation, often drugging the child and then tying a string or ribbon around its neck. She continued to travel far and wide, this time targeting wealthier clients and insisting on high adoption fees. She continued this for a decade without further scrutiny from the law. The extent of Amelia Dyer's baby farming operation and her movements during this time are extremely difficult to trace, but you get an idea as to their extent if you read an interview given by her daughter Mary Ann, which was printed in London's Weekly Dispatch in June of 1896. One section reads, "I never could quite understand why Mother was always moving, and once I remember we went into a place on a Saturday night and were clear out of it on Tuesday." Throughout the entire article, Mary Ann speaks extensively of being witness to countless babies changing hands for money and subsequently disappearing throughout her childhood. This brings us to 1890. I realise it's 12 months out, but the 1891 census gives us an idea of the family situation around this time. William Dyer was living with his children Mary Ann and Samuel in Stapleton, a residential area in the north-eastern suburbs of Bristol. William and Amelia had by now separated, and Ellen Thomas, Amelia's first daughter, was now 27, married and living separately. In 1890, a young governess from Exeter, after a long correspondence with Amelia Dyer, came to her home, which at this time was in the Horfield area of Bristol. The governess had fallen pregnant, the father being the son of a wealthy family from Cornwall, but when the young man's family had forbidden them to marry, he left the country. When the governess gave birth to the child at the Dyer household, Amelia offered to adopt. With no support from her family and her lover now overseas, the young woman agreed. Soon afterwards, however, the child's father returned and persuaded his parents to let the marriage go ahead. Together, the governess and her lover returned to Bristol to reclaim the baby, but an astonished Amelia Dyer told them that she had been adopted by a woman in Bristol, and then changed the story, saying that the baby was in Cheltenham. The child's parents went from Bristol to Cheltenham to London in search of their baby girl, but she was not found. Unwilling to accept that their baby had disappeared, they referred the case to the authorities and in October of 1891 visited Amelia Dyer once again, this time with a police officer. She maintained the adoption story, but unable to convince them, and now facing possible legal action, she made another attempt on her own life. Amelia's daughter Mary Ann Palmer, who was present at the time, said that her brother found her in the garden, almost unconscious, after trying to slit her own throat. As a result, Dyer was committed to Gloucester County Asylum in November of 1891, where she remained until her discharge in January of 1892. But the once forbidden lovers in search of their baby continued to haunt Dyer. They returned in December of 1893, again with the threat of legal action. This is when Amelia Dyer had a, some might say, convenient mental breakdown. Becoming violent, falling into a catatonic state, and claiming that she was hearing voices, Dyer was sent to the Somerset and Bath County Asylum on Boxing Day 1893. Many believe that she faked the entire episode in order to escape to the asylum and avoid capture, but others argued that she would have had to have been inspected by a doctor and certified insane before she could be committed to such a place, suggesting that her mental breakdown was genuine. Life was to get no easier for Dyer following her discharge from the asylum on the 20th of January 1894, because in April she would get a third hostile visit from the determined parents of the missing baby. Seeing no other way out of her web of lies, Dyer made an attempt on her own life yet again, this time throwing herself into a brook in the Ashton Park area of Bristol. She was rescued by onlookers, however, and spent 2 weeks at the Bristol General Hospital, during which time the hospital was reportedly visited by a man looking for Dyer and inquiring about a lost child. Once she had recovered from her ordeal, she was allowed to return home. Her daughter Mary Ann, who was now married and based in Devonport, Plymouth, moved in with her temporarily. But the recent attempts on her own life and the stress caused by 2 determined parents wasn't enough to end Dyer's baby farming days. She continued to take in babies, and life for her ran smoothly for a while. That is until December of 1894, when the governess and her husband returned for what would be the last time. The details of this meeting are not clear, but on their final departure, Amelia Dyer was said to be animated, speaking of how God had forsaken her and that the entire world was against her. Dr. William Eden, who was called to the house, refused to engage in conversation with Dyer while he listened to her sometimes incoherent ramblings and violent threats. It's said that within 10 minutes Dr. Eden had signed a certificate for her to be committed to an asylum. During Dyer's stints in these asylums, the children at her home were either returned to their mothers or placed in care of women's workhouses. On the 15th of December 1894, she entered Gloucester County Asylum for a second time. When she was finally discharged in February of 1895, she entered the Barton Regis Women's Workhouse, a place where those unable to support themselves financially were offered accommodation and employment. During her time there, she met 74-year-old Jane Smith, whom she persuaded to join her in a business venture. They would care for unwanted babies, she told Jane, painting a picture of an attractive and honest business arrangement, one that Jane Smith bought into wholeheartedly. On leaving the workhouse under the name of Annie Smith, Dyer spent her final weeks in Bristol, in the Fish Ponds area, taking Jane Smith with her. During that short period, Dyer adopted a 2-year-old boy named Bertie. According to neighbours, Bertie was being cared for temporarily by Dyer and Smith. The long-term plan, as far as they knew, was for Bertie to be reunited with his parents in Cardiff, Wales. Dyer and Smith did leave for Cardiff, but when they did, Bertie was not with them. Later that day, he was found walking alone in the Durdham Downs area of Bristol. When the NSPCC, which was only 2 years old at this point, investigated, they found an empty house at Fish Ponds. Amelia Dyer never returned to Bristol. Cardiff was the intended new home for the entire Dyer family. Amelia's daughter Mary Ann and her husband Arthur moved in too, but after just 6 weeks, due to a much lower income than they were used to, the family moved away again, this time to Caversham, Reading. When they arrived, the new house was locked. There was no one there to meet them, and the furniture they had sent ahead of time had been returned. Could the landlord have been tipped off about Amelia Dyer's illicit business? It did appear that by now she had a reputation that was following her. Undeterred, the family found temporary accommodation at 6 Elm Villas before moving to 26 Pigots Road. By now they had been joined by Willie Thornton, a 9-year-old boy who Amelia Dyer adopted as a nurse child. By the end of 1895 the unit was split again. Mary Ann and Arthur Palmer moved to Willesden in northwest London, while Amelia Dyer, Jane Smith and Willie Thornton remained in Reading, moving to 45 Kensington Road. However, by now Jane Smith had realised that she wasn't the equal business partner she expected to be. In fact, she was no more than a servant to Dyer, who brought so many babies into the house and just as quickly took them away that Jane Smith lost count of how many there had been. Eyewitnesses later told police that as many as 6 children would enter the premises during the busiest times, and that she had taken in as many as 18 babies over the 1895 Christmas period. Jane Smith was becoming increasingly concerned about the way Amelia Dyer was conducting her so-called business. In January of 1896, Jane spoke to the wife of NSPCC officer Charles Bennett and shared these concerns. Charles Bennett paid Dyer a visit, and after finding that, apart from Willie Thornton, there was also 2 babies on the premises, he reminded Dyer that it was against the law to have more than one unregistered infant under the 1872 Infant Life Protection Act. Dyer then adopted 11-year-old Ellen Maud Oliver, also known as Nellie, as a second nurse child. Both Nellie Oliver and Willie Thornton were to serve as healthy, well-looked-after decoys for the authorities. It seems inconceivable, even when you consider the accepted high infant mortality rate, that Dyer was able to evade the law for so long. But it was now March of 1896, and we return to the scene at Caversham Weir and bargeman Charles Humphrey's discovery of baby Helena Fry. As previously mentioned, Dyer's address at Kensington Road was quickly ascertained, but police knew that they had to proceed with caution. They used a young woman as a decoy. She arranged a meeting with Amelia Dyer for the 3rd of April, offering her child for the sum of £50. The investigation was headed by Chief Constable George Chewsley, who was assisted by Detective Constable James B.T. Anderson and Sergeant Harry James. When James and Anderson came face to face with a shocked Amelia Dyer, 45 Kensington Road was raided. The men were met with the stench of human decomposition, and although no human remains were found, the house was full of evidence. There were adoption papers, children's vaccination certificates, letters from hopeful parents, receipts for newspaper advertisements, and cupboards full of baby clothes. White tape, like the kind found around the neck of Helena Fry, was also found. The house was more populated than expected too. As well as Amelia Dyer, Jane Smith, Nellie Oliver and Willie Thornton, there was a 3-month-old, a lodger named Mrs. Chandler and her 2 daughters. When Anderson and James made their way upstairs, a strong smell of decomposition led them to an empty box, which showed clear signs that it once contained a corpse. Mrs. Chandler, who apparently knew nothing of the horrors that the house once held, said that she'd complained about the smell, but Dyer had refused to acknowledge it. Amelia Dyer was arrested that day, and so too, as an accessory, was her son-in-law, 26-year-old Arthur Ernest Palmer. After he was interviewed at his home in London, Chief Constable Chewsley believed that he was concealing his mother-in-law's guilt. The next day, Dyer and Palmer appeared before a magistrate at Reading Police Court. Dyer was remanded at Reading Prison while police made a full investigation. When asked about her comments on the charge of murder, she replied, "I don't know anything about it. It's all a mystery to me." As an interesting side note, Amelia Dyer's time on remand at Reading Jail coincided with time spent by one of its most famous inmates. Oscar Wilde had arrived at the prison the previous November. He was serving a 2-year sentence for gross indecency after his affair with Lord Alfred Douglas, the son of the 9th Marquess of Queensberry. Amelia wrote many letters while awaiting her hearing, full of confession and alleged remorse. As well as Chief Constable George Chewsley, she wrote to her daughter and son-in-law apologising for the harm and anguish she had caused them, assuring them that she would see to it that the law knew that they were innocent. During the week after Dyer's arrest, the River Kennet and sections of the Thames were dredged between Caversham and the village of Sonning. 7 babies were pulled from the water during that time, all in the vicinity of Caversham Weir and Clappers Bridge, but only 3 were identified. As well as Helena Fry, there was 4-month-old Doris Marmon and 13-month-old Harry Simmons, who were both found on the 10th of April in a carpet bag floating in Caversham Weir. Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons were Dyer's last known victims. Little is known of Helena Fry. From letters found at Dyer's residence, it was deduced that her mother was Mary Fry, a housemaid from Bristol, and her father a wealthy merchant. Mary Fry handed Helena over to Dyer on the 5th of March 1896 for the sum of £10. The brick found with Helena was matched to those found in the garden of 45 Kensington Road, and although baby Helena is widely accepted to be the first Thames victim found, there was no way to conclusively prove her identity. Doris Marmon's mother was 25-year-old Helena Marmon. She was described as an attractive woman, a barmaid from Cheltenham, Gloucester. In January of 1896, shortly after Doris was born, she had answered an advertisement placed in the Bristol Times and Mirror. It read, "We are plain, homely people, in fairly good circumstances. I don't want a child for money's sake, but the company and home comfort. I and my husband are dearly fond of children. I have no child of my own. A child with me will have a good home and a mother's love." The advertisement was placed by Amelia Dyer under the name Mrs. Harding. Helena Marmon reportedly wanted to pay a more affordable weekly fee for her daughter's care, but Amelia insisted on the one-off fee of £10. As Miss Marmon was in such an impoverished situation, she agreed. On the 31st of March, a time when the law was, unbeknownst to Dyer, already on her trail, she met Helena Marmon in Cheltenham. Miss Marmon later said that she was taken aback by Dyer's appearance. She had expected a much younger woman, but appreciating how affectionate Dyer was towards her daughter, she reluctantly handed over baby Doris, a box of baby clothes and £10. Amelia Dyer then accompanied the distraught woman back to her home, and a week later she sent Miss Marmon a brief note saying that all was well. Marmon wrote back, but received no reply. Amelia Dyer did not travel to Reading as she had told Helena Marmon. She went instead to 76 Mayo Road, Willesden, northwest London, the home of her daughter and son-in-law, their adopted son Harry and landlady Charlotte Cullum. Mary Ann Palmer, speaking later in court, gave her account of what allegedly transpired on the evening of her mother's arrival. According to the Western Mercury newspaper dated May 9, 1896, Mary Ann said that her mother had arrived at her home with a large bag containing a swaddled baby and a box containing a little white dress. She said that her mother told her she was looking after the child for a neighbour back in Reading, and when she asked if she could see her, Dyer refused, saying that the baby was sleeping and she didn't want her to be disturbed. According to Mary Ann, she saw no more of her mother or the baby that night and retired to bed. The next day, both women travelled to Paddington Station where they met Mrs. Amelia Hannah Sargent. Sargent was the carer of 13-month-old Harry Simmons. After she handed over Harry along with a partial payment of £5, Amelia Dyer and her daughter returned to Willesden. What exactly transpired when they arrived back at 76 Mayo Road with Harry Simmons is uncertain, but the following statements from Mary Ann, taken from the proceedings of the Old Bailey in May of 1896, tells a strange and twisted story, and in my opinion goes some way to exposing all involved as guilty. My mother shook the child before I gave it the bread and butter. She was cross with it. She said that she could not keep it, called it a little devil, and passed a remark that I cannot quite remember now. We got back around 2 p.m. About 6 that same evening, my mother asked me if I was going to put my little boy to bed, and I said yes. I might have been out of the room for 10 or 15 minutes. When I got back to the sitting room, the baby was lying on the couch, covered all over with her shawl. I did not see its face. I asked my mother if it had gone to sleep, and she said yes. I went to look at it, but she pushed me away and said that I was not to touch him or I should wake him. Before I went into my bedroom, it had been crying. It had stopped crying a few minutes before I left the sitting room. When I came back, I did not know it was a baby on the couch, any more than it looked like the child. I only saw the shape of the child covered up with the shawl. Soon after, my husband came into the room. He asked if we had been to fetch the child. I said yes. He looked across at the couch and asked if that was the little nipper there. He walked towards the couch. My mother told him not to go to him or touch him because the child was asleep. Between 7 and 7:30 I went out with my mother and my husband. Before going out, she asked me if I could lock up her carpet bag in the box. I said no and asked her what she had in it to want to lock it up. She said she had nothing in particular, but did not want other people in the room pulling her things about. When we went out, she locked the door of the sitting room. At that time, the carpet bag was under the couch, and the child was still asleep on the couch, completely covered up by the same shawl. It had been on the couch from the time I went into the room at 6:15 until we went out about 7 or 7:30. I had been in the room all the while. I had not noticed it move or utter a sound during that time. Nobody had gone to look at it in my presence. I had given it some bread, butter and milk before it was put down on the couch, and it had some more at tea time when we had our tea before 6 o'clock. After 6 it had neither moved or made a sound, nor had anybody looked at it. Mary Ann then goes on to say that the next day she saw her mother take a brick from the garden and place it beneath the couch. She also claimed that some white tape had gone missing from her work bag, and moreover, while she was later tidying the living room, she saw a small package under the couch. She said that when she asked her mother where the child was, Dyer replied, "It's all right, don't worry about him." On the morning of the 2nd of April, Dyer paid her daughter's outstanding rent and gave her landlady, Mrs. Cullum, a pair of children's boots as a gift for her young daughter. Then, with the bodies of Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons stacked into a carpet bag, along with bricks, Amelia Dyer left Willesden. Once back in Reading, she headed for a secluded spot at Caversham Weir and forced the carpet bag through the railings into the River Thames. There was a witness to this act who would later make his statement at the hearing. William Povey, who had recognised Dyer from her portrait in the Berkshire Chronicle, said that he'd seen her crossing the recreation ground at King's Meadow on the 2nd of April. The bag she carried must have been heavy, he said, as she had to stop and catch her breath. Povey said that when she approached the lock, she stood for a while looking at the water. For a moment he thought that she was going to jump in, but she turned and walked away. When she did, the large bag had gone. Harry Simmons was identified by Amelia Hannah Sargent. Sargent had cared for Harry on behalf of his biological mother, a widow named Lizzie Simmons. When Simmons failed to visit or pay for the boy's upkeep, Amelia Sargent handed him over to Dyer, who went by the name Mrs. Thomas. One of the bricks weighing the bag down was found to have come from the back garden of the house in Willesden, where Mary Ann and Arthur Palmer lived. Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons were laid to rest at Reading Old Cemetery. Their grave is unmarked.